This chapter 23 covers conservation biology. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about what conservation biology is, why we think that biodiversity is important. We'll then talk about some of the primary threats to biodiversity, and we'll end by talking about the Endangered Species Act. In class, we're going to talk a little bit more about approaches to conservation and look at various strategies that you might employ and things that you might be able to do yourself. So conservation biology takes really everything we've learned all semester in this class and links it together with some other disciplines to try to protect biodiversity. So it has a goal. We want to increase biodiversity and counter the biodiversity crises that are going on that we'll talk about a little bit more today in this video and in class. It pulls in lots of areas of science, including physiology, social science, biogeography, natural resources, as well as ecological concepts that we've been looking at this semester. So why is protecting biodiversity important? Well, big thing is that we need it. We really do. We use a lot of different wild species and domesticated species for our own livelihoods, for food, for fuel, for access to fiber, for making clothes and resources for building, medicines, spices, and just for decoration. So, we're reliant on things that are in our world for our everyday lives. We also are dependent on ecosystem services. So these are things like water purification. So when we get rid of waste, that waste needs to be remediated in some way. And the waste goes through and is cleaned up by various organisms. Soil formation. So we need there to be soil so we can grow crops and we can eat them. We need pollination. So we need insect pollinators like bees to be able to help maintain our crop sources. We also rely on the ecosystem for climate regulation and flood control so that we don't have large scale environmental disasters on a regular basis, and we're able to live without fear of extreme climate. Besides all that, besides the kind of commodity view of biological organisms, there's also this concept of biophilia, which is that we just really like biodiversity. There have been studies that have looked at whether people prefer to have a diverse ecosystem or an ecosystem that has not so much diversity, and by and large they would prefer environments that are diverse in the species compositions. We also have this feeling of stewardship or obligation for other species, thinking that other species have a right to exist, and that we as humans are obliged to not get in the way of or inhibit other species from existing. A lot of this came about when there were large-scale extinctions of organisms, such as passenger pigeons and bison and use of bird feathers in hats, and how this was really drastically altering species compositions in our world. And we began to realize that if we didn't take action, that we would see more loss of biodiversity. However, we need to try and separate our feelings from objectivity. And in general, science tries to call for objectivity, so not using bias in your interpretation of data. However, conservation biology is such a emotionally charged subject that it's really hard to separate that. And most conservation biologists got into the field because they cared about biodiversity loss and they valued biodiversity. So it's really a difficult field to be in that people working in it must balance their desires for conservation with their scientific methodology. So, what is going on out there? Well, we do see large-scale declines in biodiversity. Rates of extinction are hard to measure. However, looking at the fossil record and estimating background extinction rates, background extinction rates are about one species every 200 years. So if we look throughout the fossil record, it varies, and there have been large-scale extinctions before humans existed. But on average, when we're not looking at a large-scale extinction, we see about one species go extinct every 200 years. So average lifespan of a species is about 1 to 10 million years based on this. So if you look at that, so the typical species will last for that long. However, today, current extinction rate for mammals and birds is about 1 per year. So not 1 per 200 years, 1 per year. And that's an average lifespan of about 10,000 years rather than 1 to 10 million. And overall, extinction rates in the 20th century are 100 to 1,000 times higher than background rates, because it's not just mammals and birds that are going extinct, it's lots of other species as well. We see this especially pronounced in some of our most vulnerable groups of organisms, such as amphibians. And globally, amphibians are in extreme danger of large-scale extinctions. About 1/3 of the known species of amphibians are at least threatened with extinction. A lot of this is because they are adapted to small, narrow habitat ranges. They have very little ability to deal with large-scale changes in climate and pollution. And also there's been large fungal pathogens that are influencing them and causing large declines in their population number. A lot of the problems that we see have to do with small populations, and this is something that we're going to go into more detail in class. There's this thing called an extinction vortex, and this is something that happens predominantly in small populations, where small populations which have very low levels of genetic diversity or demographic variability, whenever there are small changes environmentally, they are very likely to go extinct. And as members of them die, this makes the population more and more vulnerable to extinction. And we will talk about the extinction vortex and the problem of small populations in more detail in class. So what's the consequence to this loss of biodiversity through extinction? Well, when populations are lost, then their services are lost. And because lots of organisms are linked together through mutualisms or through predator-prey interactions or through all the other kinds of interactions we've talked about this semester, extinction in one species is often followed by extinctions in other species. And these are what are called secondary extinctions. And so this then dramatically changes the ecosystem functions. So for instance, this is a study here on the right looking at pollinator reduction, and when they removed pollinators, these bagged flowers, the green bands, they showed that especially on island populations, the flowers produced by that produce seeds went down dramatically. So you lose a pollinator, you're going to start losing the flowers. You're gonna start losing the plants that rely on them. Right, so you're going to end up with secondary extinctions. Okay. So, what is it that causes biodiversity loss, and what are the major threats? Well, the most major threat to biodiversity is habitat loss, and humans have been a huge contributor to habitat loss. We've modified, some have estimated, about 60% of the Earth's land surface. And we've impacted marine ecosystems as well. We have appropriated about 10, on the low end of estimations, to more than half, on the high ends of estimations, of Earth's primary production through harvesting of trees, through planting of farmland, conversion of soil from one thing to the next. So what does this do? Well, if we convert soils into agricultural land, if we develop urban environments, if we cut down trees for forestry, if we destroy environments through mining, or if we just destroy it through pollution, we run the risk of exacerbating the extinctions. So organisms might not be able to get from one patchy habitat to another patchy habitat because there might not be any alternate habitat available, or the species simply can't move. So imagine if you were a species living in this patch of land here, if you did not have enough space now for your population to grow, where are you going to go? You're going to have to move across this barren land to another patch, and maybe you can't get there. Maybe it's just too far. Maybe there are too many predators. Maybe there are too many hazards in your way. So in what ways are habitats lost? Well, they're lost simply through conversion of one form of land to another. They're lost through fragmentation, so breaking up of continuous habitats into patches, and those patches might not be big enough to support as many organisms as once lived in that area, or just through degradation, so reducing the quality. So maybe not completely getting rid of it, but reducing the quality of it, and this could be through pollution, this could be through nearby developments leading to loss of quality of the habitat. Maybe you're getting rid of the food source for an animal. They might have shelter, but not a food source, and this can cause lots and lots of problems. So habitat loss, major impact on biodiversity. A second thing that can threaten biodiversity is introduced species. So introduced species are species that have moved from their native location to a new habitat. When they move, they're often free from predators, pathogens, and parasites. Now, a lot of introduced species don't survive, or they aren't able to reproduce in their new environment. They might be that they're moved from a tropical environment to a more temperate environment and they can't survive the winter. Or it might be that there are pathogens that they are impacted by. But if they can survive, because they lack predators, because they lack parasites and pathogens, they often can multiply more rapidly than native species and start to take over. And we call these invasive species. So introduced species are just species that are from not in their native habitat. An invasive species is one that is overtaking and causing detriment to the native species. So this can lead to habitat loss, this can lead to degradation of habitats, and can not only impact competing native species, but can also impact any other species in that environment. For instance, Hawaii has been hugely impacted by this. The tropical dry forests have been all but eradicated. Invasive grasses have increased and have really caused a huge impact on these native populations of plants. All right. A third thing is overexploitation. So humans are well known for harvesting more than can be sustainable. So we harvest more from the wild than the wild can produce. And this is causing the decline of large numbers of species. Here's an example of, we harvest organisms for trophies, for tusks, for instance, and we are just all but eradicating through hunting various species. So it's really, we're taking them at a higher rate than they can be replaced. So these are tigers and elephant tusks, for example here. Overfishing. So these are two pictures from Key West, Florida. The top is in 1957, the bottom is in 2007. You can see we're causing a dramatic decrease in catch size. So these fish used to be gigantic, and we've now decreased the size of the top predators. It's been a decline of more than 50% in trophy length in those 50 years. We do this through simply overfishing, but we also do this by bycatch. So our methods of fishing. For every ton of fish caught by commercial trawlers, there are 1 to 4 tons of other marine mammals, marine animals. These are what are called bycatch. Bycatch could be mammals, could be birds, could be turtles. They sometimes are useful species, but a lot of times they're just thrown back, and I'd say the majority of them do not survive. And so we're killing things just to throw them back. And this has to do with our methods. So trawling is a very quick way of catching lots and lots of commercial organisms, but it's a very wasteful way as well. Okay. So what do we do about this? Well, we'll talk a little bit more about this in class, and we're going to talk especially about different approaches for saving things. But I wanted to end this video by talking very briefly about conservation biology and the Endangered Species Act. So one debate that conservation biologists often happen is, should we focus on species or habitat? Now there's a large growing amount of work that looks at habitat and why habitat might be important, but legislation is really hard to focus on habitat, and it's much easier to focus on species. You must actually have a lot of the science behind this known to be able to protect habitats. So you do have to understand species. And just knowing count of species can be a much easier way of going about it and designing legislation. So we have legislation, the U.S. Endangered Species Act, and the Endangered Species Act protects individual species through protecting their habitat. So by identifying species in need, you then identify the habitat that needs to be protected. So there are a number of things that you cannot do if you identify an endangered species in an area. You can't develop it without a lot of difficulty. So Endangered Species Act lists species and identifies critical habitat, also comes up with recovery plans and tries to outline actions to increase abundance of certain species. It's our main legislation for protecting threatened and endangered species, which are different categories of species abundance and likelihood of extinction. At least as the last time I looked it up, which it probably should be updated by now, but there was around 1,300 native species listed in the endangered species as endangered or threatened. The Endangered Species Act also regulates trade, and through international treaties and conventions, you can't sell endangered products from endangered species, and you can't trade them internationally with most countries of the world. Okay, so in class we're going to talk a little bit more about ways of identifying areas for conservation, and also look at biodiversity and biodiversity loss in a little bit more detail, but this should give you a fairly good overview of the subject.